everyone, welcome to the Roots YouTube channel. My name is Jessica. Today's tutorial is how to do wraparound faux fur binding on your quilt. So before we get started, let me remind you to subscribe down below. If you're on social media and there's any project you want me to see, make sure you use hashtag #OaklerRootsToots. Give this video a like if at any point you like the video. Make sure you put all of your questions and comments in the comment section down below. Links to pretty much everything I'll be using in this video will be in the description below. And the first comment that I pin at the top that's by me will have timestamps for every step of the tutorial. So if there's just one spot you're interested in, you can just click on that timestamp and it'll take you straight to it in the video. By this point in your quilting process, you should have already done your quilt top. That's completed. And you should have your batting and your backing and your quilt sandwich done. Now your backing needs to be faux fur. So this is my faux fur, and I'll have a link for this down below. I make a lot of faux fur quilts. Here are a couple of examples of faux fur quilts I've made previously. You can see the back is all faux fur, the front is my quilt top, and the back just wraps around the front. My binding is actually just a wraparound binding that's faux fur. I also find that using the wraparound binding method instead of like a quilt cotton binding when using a faux fur backing gives it a much plusher feel, right? So when you're all snuggled up under here, you got your chin right on the binding, still soft. Now you can see this one, the binding is pretty thick. On the gray faux fur quilt, the binding's a little bit thinner. See? So it's just total personal preference. The one thing you have to remember is that when you're making your quilt top, you need to add some borders around the perimeter of the quilt top so that way you can add the faux fur binding without covering up your beautiful quilt. If we were using a regular quilt cotton binding, it's about 1/4 of an inch that covers the edge. That's not much. That's included, that's a seam allowance, right? That's included in your seam allowance, so it wouldn't actually cover up the design of your quilt top. However, with faux fur, we like to give it a nice thick binding. So if you don't add those borders on, you're going to end up covering up some of your design on your beautiful quilt top. So make sure you take the time to add the borders. And we're going to discuss how big of a border you should add in just a moment. All right, so let's get into the nitty gritty. Let's start talking about what we need and all the steps we need to take to accomplish wraparound faux fur binding. All right, so the first thing you're going to need is your quilt, right? Like I said, you have your quilt top completed. You have it sandwiched already, and I will have a link for my video up above on how to pin baste this so you can sandwich your layers. I used a basic sheet as my backing in the video for that, but it's the same exact method for faux fur. So you have it all sandwiched, and you have a light quilting done. Now this is what I mean by a light quilting. You can see these big blocks here about the size of my hand are not quilted yet. I will probably go back and quilt in these smaller blocks at another time. But what I like to do is just do kind of almost like a basting stitch, but it's a quilt. So a basting quilt. Just running along the major lines of the quilt to just hold it together really well. And then I also make sure I go along the very edge of the parameter as well. Especially with the faux fur, you're going to want to make sure that you go along the entire edge first before you start trimming and adding your binding on. This quilting on the very edge is going to make the step that we're going over today much easier. And then you can always go back later and quilt, designs in these spots on your own. Now, faux fur is thick. I don't quilt my faux fur throws on my sewing machine. I only hand quilt my faux fur throws. Now, I'm not saying you can't. I'm just saying I don't. Like I said, here's our quilt ready to be bound. Our faux fur, we left a few inches wide around the quilt, which you're supposed to do anyways, right? When you're sandwiching your quilt, your backing should always be a few inches wider. So I especially wanted to leave it wider this time though, because I'm going to be using this width to turn it over and make a nice thick binding around the front of the quilt. I would say around 3 to 4 inches around the entire perimeter. So each side should have, some sides have a lot, and 3 to 4 inches around the entire perimeter. I'm going to be using a 2.5 inch wide binding on this. So obviously I just wanted a little bit bigger than that so I have wiggle room to cut it and resize it. So besides your quilt, you're also going to need some thread. This is just a 50 weight cotton thread by Aurifil. And I will have a link for this below. I like to use a thread that matches my binding, but the faux fur is so dense that if you didn't have a matching thread on hand, you would be fine because the threads will not be seen. Also, I'm going to be using these needles today. Honestly, I don't have a go-to needle. I just kind of use whatever I can find. These are by Sue Daly. They're milliner's needles, size 9. I like a needle that's not too short or too long, but has a big enough eye hole that I can get the thread through. Since this is a thinner thread, which is a 50 weight, this is not going to be a problem. So these are the needles I'm using, and I will have a link for these below. You're also going to need something to protect your fingers. If you have hand quilted up to this point, hopefully you've been using one of these things. But you can use a thimble pad, which these are just little stickies that you stick on your finger, or you can use a leather thimble, which I like to use pretty often. And this just goes on your finger, on whichever finger you need it to go on. And it's going to protect your finger from the end of the needle going into it. Because when you're going through layers of fabric, sometimes you have to push a little hard. And the pointy end is not the end you always have to worry about. The threaded end can also go in your finger. Ask me how I know. And then last, you're going to need your basic cutting tools. Rotary cutter, fabric scissors, and a ruler to help you trim everything down to size. I also like to have a smaller pair of scissors for my thread, just because these, are big and thread is not. So, small pair of scissors as well. All right, so let's start prepping our quilt. So the first thing I want to do with my quilt is get rid of the extra batting. I don't really feel a need to have the batting as part of the binding. You are more than welcome to do that if you would like. If you would like to just trim this down, but I don't find it necessary. So I am just going to cut off the batting right at the quilt line. So if this was a typical quilt where we were going to be adding a separate cotton binding around the end later, what we would do is we would just actually slice off the back and the binding all in one go, right? We just take our ruler and slice it down. But we don't want to lose this beautiful faux fur backing. Don't cut your quilt top. Don't cut your backing. Don't worry about this being perfect. If it's not right up to the edge, it's fine. I would suggest even not trying to get it to the edge. Just get it, a 1/4 of an inch. One way to make this step a little bit easier is to take your backing here and fold it under so that if you lift up your batting, you don't have anything on the back. This will just make sure you don't accidentally cut your backing because, yeah, we really don't want to cut the backing. And that way you can just go easily down the edge. So we have the batting trimmed down. So now we just have our beautiful, so soft faux fur backing ready to be trimmed. Now, my borders that I added to my quilt top. Now remember, you add your borders to your quilt top before you sandwich your quilt, before you quilt your quilt. This is just a scrappy quilt I put together last minute, and then I needed it to be wider because I didn't want my faux fur to cover these blocks here. So I added a border that I don't mind having most of it covered for my binding. Now, my border that I added are 4-inch wide strips. So I added 4-inch wide strips along the top and bottom and the sides. My binding, I would like to be 2.5 inches wide. So right now, it's about 3.5 inches wide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my ruler, and I'm going to use my rotary cutter, and I'm going to go along and I'm going to measure 2.5 inches from the side of the quilt and just trim my backing all around. You will notice this step is very messy. Have a vacuum on hand. Make sure you flatten the area out real nice. Like I said, I'm going to measure 2.5 inches from the side of the quilt. If you gave yourself a real choppy, messy batting cut like I did, just try to ignore that and just measure from the edge of your quilt top. It gets real messy in here. So this means whenever I fold it over, I'll have a nice 2.5-inch strip of binding. So I still have a little bit of my border, but it'll be binding. All right, so let's start working on wrapping around this binding and stitching it in place. I'm going to use adhesive thimble. You can reuse these about 3 times or so before they lose their stickiness, or even longer. So I like to put on my middle finger because that's the finger I push with. Let me grab some of my thread. I like to double up my thread, so I make my thread a little bit longer, 24 inches long. Doing double thread, you let your 2 ends meet, pinch them together, and then just wrap it around the needle about 3 or 4 times, and then pull it over the needle and onto the thread. Now you have a nice little knot on the end. So you can use some clips to help keep your binding in place so you know where the edge is. Just pull the needle through the quilt top where it will be covered by the binding first, just like that. And then I don't even fold over my binding. I did once and it was such a pain that I decided not to do that again. And you don't need to, because even though this is a raw edge, it's going to hold, it's not going to rip out, and the fur is going to cover any of your stitches along the raw edge. So push it up through the fur, and just like adding binding in my previous video, you have it up through the fur, you go back into the quilt top, underneath the binding, push it up again through the fur, work your way forward, you go behind the stitch you just made, and then push it into the quilt top and up through the fur in front of that previous stitch, just like that. And then I just go along the entire length of the quilt like this. And you can see this is the spot that I've already stitched. You cannot see the raw edge of the fabric at all. It just looks like it's kind of made with the quilt top. All right, so I like to tie off my string right before I get to a corner so that I can use another piece of thread exclusively for the corner. When you're about 2.5 inches or 3 inches away from the corner. So I like to clip the tip of my corner off because it will just get in the way. So just about 1/2 inch down or so, maybe 3/4 of an inch. Just clip the corner off. So when we get to the corner, we're going to fold the corner down diagonally from the point. So it's going to go down just like this, okay? And then you're going to take the part that you've already stitched, which is for me is the top part, and just fold that down so you have it against the raw edge that you haven't sewn the binding onto yet. So now your binding should look like this, where you have the part you've already sewn down, and then it's folded over nice and flat and along the same edge as the raw edge of your quilt, and then a nice 45-degree angle with your remaining binding. Now just take your remaining binding and fold that over so that the bottom point meets the edge of the sewn on binding. Now, I like to clip this in place, and because there are so many layers, I'll also use a pin just to help hold down this edge because I'm going to sew through all these layers. Now, this is not the quote-unquote right way to do this. I don't know what the right way to do this is. This is my way of doing it. I don't mind these bulky corners. They're soft, they're squishy, they don't bother me at all. So I'm okay with this method. Now, if you find a method where you can trim it to make them less bulky, I would love for you to share it with me. This method is my go-to, but it doesn't mean it's the best. I'm gonna hold it down by the seam down here. Just gonna poke this through real quick to get my knot in there. Bring it out through the already sewn on side. I'm gonna put it underneath the binding, and what I'm trying to do is get as many layers of the faux fur binding as I can in my stitches. Now I'm still going around the edge of the binding and then up and then through all the layers of binding. If you want, you can just go through the whole quilt to the end and go up. Because it's so fluffy, it's gonna hide almost any kind of stitches you make. So I go pretty far. Since I can't see where the quilt top is, I have to feel for it. But I'm pretty much just waiting until I poke my finger on the other side of the quilt before I put my needle back up. And I can tell you that my other faux fur quilts have been washed dozens of times. I haven't had any of the stitching come out of the corners or the binding. And I haven't had any problems with the faux fur kind of bunching. So I just go all the way up to the top because I don't like any of it to be able to come loose. So there we go. So now you can see, you just see one little line here and that's it. So now I like to kind of work it back down to the bottom, and then I start on the next side. Now this helps keep all of the stitching nice and tight and in place. You get that interior corner. The best thing about faux fur is that, again, because it is so fluffy and thick, there's so much room for error. You do not have to worry about your stitches being perfect or being the exact same size because no one's going to see it. And then you're just going to continue on along the remaining sides and corners with the exact same method. This is probably one of my favorite quilts to make, but I will warn you, it takes time because you're hand sewing most of this quilt. Besides the quilt top, you're hand quilting it and you're hand sewing on the binding. And it's messy, guys. If you could see, everything is covered in faux fur right now. It's going to take me a couple minutes to clean it up. Luckily, it all vacuums up very easily. But it is messy. So this is a quilt you make for yourself, or it's a quilt you make for somebody you love very, very dearly. So this is how you wrap a quilt in faux fur binding. I love it, guys. I'm a huge fan of any type of different backing. So So thanks so much for stopping by. I hope that this helped you. I hope that this inspired you to maybe try something new. I know there's not a lot of quilters out there that are using faux fur as their backing. I see it all the time, guys. I'm all over Instagram and everybody's using quilt cotton for their backings. And if that's what you love, then you do you. But man, there are so many other options. There's rayon, there's knits, there's faux fur, there's bed sheets, there's flannel. There's so many options to make those quilts snuggly. I mean, I know for some of us, our quilts are a work of art and we want to hang them on the wall, and that's fantastic. But most of my quilts, meaning all but maybe one of my quilts, are snuggle quilts. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down in the comments down below. You can always shoot me an email. I'm jessica@oakleroots.com. Make sure you check out my website where I'm going to be having exclusive videos, tutorials, walkthroughs for my email subscribers. So get out there and make something. Bye! All right, I know I'm going to get some questions about the hair. I know. My hair is short. My hair? Where's my hair? This is my hair. My hair is short and extremely thin, but now my hair is long and luscious. This is fake hair. So this is the first and this is the only time I will ever do this on my channel. But because I know I'm going to have questions and because I want to share this, which has brought me so much joy, I'm going to show you what it is. So we can get out of here. Here we go. Ta-da! There it is. There's my hair. Yep. So, if that's something you're interested in, I got my hair extension. It's called a halo hair extension. I got it from Jess Halleck. She's out of Arizona, but we did it all online. I just sent her some pictures of my head and I explained my color. We talked about length. We talked about everything, and she customized it just for me and sent it out my way. I will have a link down below for all of that if you are interested in it. Do not expect me to make this some sort of a beauty channel where I talk about this stuff a lot. But this hair is a serious confidence boost for someone like me who has had very, very thin, fine hair her whole life and just took every single vitamin you can imagine to try to get hair like that. It ain't happened naturally for me, but that looks really stinking close to the real thing, and it's super comfy and it's not permanent. It doesn't damage my hair. That's all I'm gonna say about it. All right? We're not a beauty channel. We're a crafty channel. But I want you to feel good about you, and if something like this will help you feel good about yourself, then you should definitely look into it, and do not hesitate to chat with Jess. She is amazing, sweetest person, salt of the earth. Of course, her name is Jessica. That's all. We're done. Quilting in bags.